So if we start by looking at the title of the question begins by asking us to assess the value of source one. That tells us the key term or the context in which we need to be evaluating the source. So we need to constantly be considering its value throughout the essay. It also tells us the two inquiry points that we need to consider. So the first of these is the nature of Nelson's leadership, and the second of these are reasons for the Royal Navy's success at Trafalgar. So we know already that those are the things we need to search through the source in order to be able to answer and think about. With this type of question, ideally you do want an introduction in it, and in the introduction you want to be setting the context of what the source is, a little bit of the context of the time, but also introducing your initial judgment on the two inquiry points and how valuable the source is for them. So if we look here, there's a little bit of information at the start about the source being a naval dispatch and who sent it. All of this is stuff that's visible in the blurb about the source at the top of it, and it's just being recounted here. And then it goes on to talk about how valuable the source is, so using that key term there for understanding the Royal Navy's success. So it says that it's valuable for understanding reasons for the Royal Navy's success, and his comments on Nelson make it valuable for the nature of Nelson's leadership as well. It then goes on to identify some reasons briefly why it might be less valuable. So talking about the timing of when the source is written, and talking about Collingwood's own relationship with Nelson. And then you have here the initial judgment at the end of the introduction. Overall, because of the authorship, the source is more valuable for revealing why the Navy was successful, as it presents a view on Nelson's leadership that is not objective. Going into the first paragraph then, if we look here, the very first point that we have here is again referring to the source's value. So we are really, really closely linking it in with the question. Collingwood's dispatch is valuable as it goes into depth about the formation, numbers and preparedness of the British Navy for the Battle of Trafalgar. It then goes on to integrate own knowledge and quotations from the source, because it's really important that you guys are putting quotes in from the source. With this particular one, we've underlined some key quotations in the sheet that you have that has the source on it that you can think about, but going forward you need to be able to recognize where there's a relatively short, relatively sharp quotation, but how it can be used. So here it talks about where Collingwood describes the size of the British fleet, consisting of 27 ships, 3 of them 64s. It then goes on, if we look, to add in some own knowledge. So it talks about Amiens and the naval budget being cut, and the fact that then by 1804, relatively close to the Battle of Trafalgar, you have the replacement of St. Vincent with Middleton, and how Middleton is kind of doing this big push to build the fleet back up. It then goes on to pick out from that earlier quote, in particular, the point about 64s, and it tells us this is valuable because it tells us that Britain is fighting at Trafalgar with some third-rate ships, and therefore that combined with the fact that the British fleet is outnumbered, the enemy's line consisted of 33 ships, makes it valuable overall, as it provides the inference that it's the Admiralty's push in the months before Trafalgar to improve the fleet that contributed to the success of the Navy at Trafalgar. If we move further down, it then identifies another reason that it's valuable to understand British success. And here it talks about the information that Collingwood gives us about the commanders of the fleets. So it tells us that Collingwood has identified that the French and Spanish fleets are led by 2 commanders, the implication being that there is a complication in communications, and we know that that did actually happen. And then in comparison to that, the British fleet is led entirely by Nelson, and not only that, it also tells us the style in which Nelson is leading the fleet, the fact that Britain is conforming to a mode of attack his lordship has previously directed, reducing the problems of command and communication for the British fleet. And therefore, it then goes on to solidify the comment that it's made before, saying this suggests the leadership on both sides was a factor in the success of the Royal Navy. And then a final point that it makes as to reasons that the source is valuable for understanding Royal Navy success. It talks about the tactics of the Royal Navy. So pulling points from the source, it talks about Collingwood making the signal for the fleet to bear up in 2 columns, and also then talks about the leading ship to the column breaking through the enemy's line. And here a bit of own knowledge adding in here about the fact that breaking the line is a tactic that is relatively widely used at this point amongst admirals, and we know that Nelson did favour it as a tactic. And then it says the fact that Nelson's fleet disrupted the enemy line of vessels in 2 places would have created confusion to the enemy and contributed to the success of the Royal Navy. So again, talking about how aspects from the source are helping us to kind of understand this particular inquiry. Then it links back to the idea of the mode of our attack had been previously determined and communicated to flag officers, talking about a limited need for communication by the British. And then it goes on to talk about the source is less valuable. So it says the source is less valuable when it comes to the timings of the attack. It talks about how Collingwood essentially identifies the attacks on the enemy line starting at 12 o'clock. And we know now that due to eyewitness accounts that it's closer to 20 past. And we also know that there is a time difference between when the Royal Sovereign breaks the French and Spanish lines and when the Victory breaks through. And here, just summarising up so that we kind of know how that relates to value, this means the source gives a more organised impression of the battle than was the case. It then moves on to looking at the second inquiry point, so looking at the nature of Nelson's leadership. And right in the beginning, it's still referring back to that kind of link to the source question. The source is slightly less valuable when it comes to the nature of Nelson's leadership. It is most valuable for understanding the regard Nelson was held in by his fleet. So here, the person writing this question has picked out where Nelson says the ever to be lamented death of Nelson, and then use their own knowledge to match that up. So talking about the reactions of the crew upon Nelson's death and the reactions of the rest of the fleet as well, and how it was held back from the fleet. It then talks about the strength of the reaction and linking into the type of leader that Nelson was by referring to earlier conflicts that Nelson was involved in and his actions there. So it talks about the Nile, talks about Cape St. Vincent as well, and then says that this hands-on leadership is basically shown in the source, where Collingwood says that Nelson led the weather column, therefore putting himself and his flagship in the heart of the battle. And then comes back round to say, this makes the source valuable as it suggests Nelson was a commander who led by example. It also talks about the fact that it's Nelson's leadership that also kind of links into reasons for naval success. It says it identifies aspects of Nelson's organisation and leadership that put the British fleet in the best position to win. And then it goes on about how that's valuable and picks out the bit where we know that Nelson is the one who has ensured the mode of attack is previously directed. Linked into our knowledge, it talks about the band of brothers aspect. So we know that at the Nile, Nelson was particularly successful because he'd had months of sailing with the same fleet and the same captains, where he had kind of created this very, very close relationship with lots of them and created this, what he called the band of brothers feeling. And we also know that before Trafalgar, Nelson attempts to recreate that. And it goes on to say his leadership style relied on communication and to an extent devolution, which is supported by the source's assertion that few signals were necessary. And we know then that that meant that at Trafalgar, despite limited flag signals, Nelson's captains did know when they were entering the battle what the overall plan was, because Nelson had already told them. Then the third paragraph here goes on to talk about context and also the authorship or provenance of the source. And here it says the source's value is somewhat limited by its origin and author. The fact that the source is a naval dispatch makes it valuable. The purpose of the dispatch is to inform the Admiralty of the events of the battle, and therefore it's valuable to help us understand why the British won, as it is an official account rather than a personal one, such as a letter or a memoir. However, the timing of the source could limit its value. So here we've got own knowledge bringing in, so identifying the fact that because the battle itself takes place on the 21st, Collingwood's writing on the 22nd, it's identifying that there is a lot of disarray after the Battle of Trafalgar. In terms of to kind of heighten that, it talks about the enemy vessels that managed to escape. So you have 4 French ships that escape and manage to evade capture until the 4th of November. And then also referring back to the source, although not quoting it, talks about the fact that these inaccuracies can be seen where Collingwood makes a mistake in noting the numbers of enemy ships. There's a point in the source where he talks about there being 18 French ships when actually there were 17, and 15 Spanish ships when actually there were 16. So there are some kind of notable small inaccuracies which suggest disarray. Then goes on to say, similarly, this official account is perhaps notable for the details that Collingwood chooses to leave out. And that's really key as well. Bringing in own knowledge, it identifies the fact that there are several British commanders that did not follow Nelson's orders sufficiently. Collingwood doesn't mention these in the entirety of the dispatch. And also similarly, Collingwood doesn't mention the fact that he broke the enemy line first in the Royal Sovereign, because due to recent repairs, it's much faster than anyone expects it to be. And that's in contrast to the predetermined plan, which would have seen Nelson either breaking through slightly before being in the windward column, or it would have seen kind of a breakthrough at the same time. And that links in to the main reason the source is of limited value and why it's specifically more limited for understanding the nature of Nelson's leadership. It talks about the fact that Collingwood have been friends with Nelson for 32 years. So we're not just talking about a close working relationship, we're talking about a friendship as well. And also Collingwood is fiercely loyal to Nelson. Linking back to the fact that at the beginning of the source, he again uses that term, ever to be lamented death of Nelson. He's not just referring to how Britain should feel and how the Admiralty should feel, he's also referring to how he himself is feeling in that moment. And then it goes on to say, for this reason, we can infer that a source produced by Collingwood is going to take an overly positive view on the nature of Nelson's leadership. Finally, the conclusion. This is a little bit kind of perfunctory, but it does what it needs to do. So in conclusion, the source does hold some value for both inquiries due to the amount of detail it provides and the proximity of the author to events. It also talks about, because it's an official document, it provides more value for understanding the reasons of the Navy's success, as its main task is to inform the Admiralty and British government of that. And then it finally reasserts what it said before. It's of limited value, finding out the nature of Nelson's leadership due to that close friendship, meaning that Collingwood simply isn't objective in his account.